welcome to Dialogue. The annual Shangri-La Dialogue has just wrapped up in Singapore, where defense ministers gathered to discuss security concerns in Asia and around the world. To shed some light on the key global issues and challenges facing the world today, I talked to Chen Dongxiao, president of the Shanghai Institutes for International Studies. That's our topic. I'm Xu Qinduo. Well, 10 years ago, you were here, joining this dialogue. Now, 10 years later, do you think this global security situation is worsening? We have a Ukraine war, as you mentioned, and now, China-U.S. tensions are rising in the Asia-Pacific region. So, people see there's more uncertainty than certainty. How do you see that?
Well, I agree that we have seen a deteriorating security situation, both globally and regionally. I think that generally speaking, compared with, for instance, Europe, Asia Pacific is still relatively stable, but we obviously have seen more tensions, including, as you said, that the U.S.-China more constrained relationship, as well as many other regional tensions in this area. So obviously we have seen a worsening situation and also a more difficulties in security governance.
Mm-hmm. Well, when it comes to the Shangri-La dialogue, often, probably the focus has always been like China-U.S. relationship in the arena of security affairs. And for this year, of course, the Chinese Defense Minister Li Shangfu talks about China's new security initiative. We know that last year, the Chinese President Xi Jinping put forward this global security initiative. For a lot of people, probably they are not familiar with this. What's the gist of this initiative?
I think that the key messages of this security initiative will focus on that the security is more with others rather than against others. That means the new security initiative, which has been initiated by President Xi, as well as I think nowadays has been echoed many times by Chinese officials, including the General Li's keynote speech. I think that his speech continues to focus on the comprehensiveness of the security we have faced today, and also the more cooperative nature in the security. So I think that the key message is the security should be with others for the common security, rather than the security against each other. Otherwise, I think that one party's security will definitely lead to other party's non-security or insecurity of others.
So the security of the country A should be taken into consideration. So is the security issue of country B.
Yes, this is I think, the nature of the world we are living in, because we are living in a hyper-connected, interdependent world. Whatever the size of the country, of the economies, whatever the political or whatever the differences of the political institutions and ideologies of each countries, that we have to live together for those common goods of our security, as well as against those common challenge. So I think that this is a hyper-connected, interdependent world in which we have to stress the importance of a comprehensive dimensions of security, which means that not only refers to those traditional sovereignty, territorial security or safety, but also we need to deal with how the climate change, for instance, how those public health situation, and how those even financial instability and its implications for the security of each other. So I think they are related to each other. and we have to face with them. No country would say that this country is immune from over others from those threats or challenges. So this means that we have to be inclusive. We have to be work together against those common bats.
With that in mind, how do you describe or how do you characterize the Chinese vision of the regional security in the Asia-Pacific region?
I think nowadays one of the biggest challenges we face in Asia-Pacific is we have seen the rising of those ideology-based military alliance or bloc, which exclusive to some other countries, particularly excluding China. Such kind of a ideology-based, military-focused alliance, they have polarized rather than help or facilitate the unification or integration of this region. So I think this is one of the biggest challenges that we need to work together to be against, but it's quite tough.
Mm-hmm. Well, if we look at the Ukraine issue, under the, let's say, the Chinese security or new security initiative view, what went wrong, and then we have this, crisis here in European continent?
I think fundamentally speaking, the Ukraine war or Ukraine crisis is the result of a failure of security governance on the continent of Europe. Specifically speaking, the NATO's relationship with Russia. I think that the security dilemma, while it's always kind of a phenomena with different degrees in different parts of the world, but the security dilemmas between Russia on one side and NATO on the other side is extremely deteriorated in the past few decades. And I think that NATO's expansion itself have not addressed the legitimate concerns, security concerns of Moscow, even if NATO always rejected those claims. But at the same time, I think that it's quite a deep-rooted strategic suspicion between two sides, and the failure in governing of the security dilemma and make Moscow take a quite extreme or radical manner.
So speak of NATO, I think I understand that some European politicians or experts would say, they are defensive. It's a defensive organization. Sometimes it sounds like it's an innocent, charity organization, but the others would see it's a military organization. It's threatening by nature. And then they are setting a liaison office in Tokyo. And China is concerned with that kind of expansion of NATO somehow, into Asia Pacific. Are you concerned with that?
Oh yes, I think that the NATO is a military organization set up in the Cold War era for the competition with the Warsaw Pact in the Cold War era. And the Cold War has been gone for more than 30 more years already, but the NATO is still there, and it is expanding. And also there's a trend of a globalization of NATO or Asia-Pacificalization of NATO. I think that this actually has caused more security challenge for those countries in Asia-Pacific, including China. And I also believe that some of other countries in Asia-Pacific, like ASEAN countries, they are also quite concerned about the expansion of the NATO or the Asia-Pacific version of the NATO.
What is the purpose of I think it's related to, say, the speech by the U.S. Defense Secretary, Lord Austin, which is basically surrounding the theme of U.S. leadership in the Indo-Pacific. So NATO expansion, U.S. leadership, somehow is connected?
Yeah, I think so. I think that the key messages has been has been already echoed by Secretary of Defense and many of senior officials of Pentagon. I think that the United States always believe that the leadership of the United States in the Asia-Pacific, or what in their term called the Indo-Pacific, is the indispensable for the stability and the security of this region, which I think that to some extent is quite ridiculous. I think that if United States reduce those military dimensions or reduce their momentum of security alliance expansion, I think it will actually facilitate more stability in this region, and also will invest more of their resources on economic cooperation. But of course, I think that maybe United States now realize, in addition to those military or security dimension, they are also going to inject more momentum on economic dimension into the so-called leadership. Let's see that what we will see of their alleged leadership.
Yeah, the Chinese side has put forward its version or its vision of a security in terms of a security initiative globally and probably for China too. And here the US is talking about its leadership. So how do you see these two different versions of, or two different vision of security for the Asia-Pacific region?
Well, I think that the key differences is between one is the perception of the threats. I think from Beijing's perspective, the key challenge or the threat to the regional security is those ideology-based and the military-focused alliance, which will make this region even more fragmented and polarized instead of a more integration and unification. So I think this is always, Beijing said that we need to focus on the inclusiveness and the cooperative security. While I think that Washington's perspective is the strategic culture or their strategic security culture is focused on the so-called enemy hunting. And they are more concerned about the so-called pacing peer, here refers to China. And they believe the rising China is definitely the threat of this security. Actually, is the threat. I think that they believe it is the challenge to the leadership or the primacy of the United States in this region. But of course, I think that this is very misleading. But anyway, I think that as long as the Washington continue to build up those security alliance, it has caused more concerns than instability.
Mm-hmm. And then, of course, China-U.S. security relationship is critical in terms of peace and stability in this region. Right before the dialogue, the Shangri-La dialogue, there's an episode of basically the Chinese side rejected the U.S. overture to have meetings between the two defense ministers. And of course, the reality is like the U.S. has failed to lift or to remove the coercive measures against the Chinese side, against the Chinese defense minister. So if the U.S. truly wants to have a dialogue, how difficult it is to remove those measures?
Well, that's a very good question. I think that we have seen quite a contradictory or conflicting message coming from Washington. On one side, I think that to pursue or to have a serious lines of communication, including the DOD on their side and the PLA on China's side, is very important, because to have those DOD and the PLA people always have a dialogue, particularly at the senior level, is very important for the confidence building and even for crisis management. But on the other side, as you said, that Beijing is not in the interest of the talk just for the sake of talk. The purpose of a talk is to build up confidence, as well as to reduce the miscalculation. And I think that in order to show the sincerity Washington should do something to show that such kind of dialogue is not only for the sake of dialogue, it's not only kind of a show, but also to really to reduce the tension, to reduce the miscalculation. And I think that some of those sanctions are very important signals that Washington should do, removing those sanctions by their previous administrations. So I think that this is the reason why Beijing rejected that. I think that Washington's statements that they are quite concerned about the so-called Beijing's uninterested in engaging with or have a dialogue with the United States is very misleading.
Yeah, they are blaming the Chinese side for, in their words, lack of willingness to engage.
It's unfair. It's obviously unfair. I think that Beijing is interested in. Beijing's always say that we are going to have a talk with you, but to talk for what?
It's a good point. If you look at the speeches or the remarks made by the U.S. senior officials, including probably the one by Lord Austin and also other senior officials, cabinet officials, about the importance of talking to China. But there's a lack of substance. What they are going to talk about, and is there any willingness or readiness to make or we are going to lift some of the, for example, the tariffs imposed on the Chinese goods and services. Do you see any substantial offer from Washington to put on the table? Let's talk about what?
I think that Washington may have some list of the topics which Washingtonians think that those officials from Beijing should address them. But at the same time, I also think that some of those obstacles, including, I think, during or before the talk or during the process of preparing for the talk, from Washington's side, Beijing also follow very closely that whether Washington has the political will to remove some of those obstacles, to show their sincerity. That's very important. Otherwise, Beijing would be very concerned that whether it's just a kind of a political show, all right, just for their domestic audience, to the domestic audience in Washington say that, okay, US government has the capability to resume the dialogue with Beijing counterparts. Mm-hmm. But actually they have any political will to remove those obstacles, which Beijing, I think, raised, and I also believe they are very legitimate.
Well, and of course, one of the, I would say, probably the top issue in terms of these problems between the two countries is the Taiwan question. Since Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House, her provocative visit to Taiwan, and then there is a strong response from the Chinese side, and we can see tensions surrounding Taiwan has been escalating until today, probably. So, of course, both sides are talking about the status quo. Which side is probably altering or changing the status quo?
Well, I'm trained as a political scientist, and I'm always very cautious about those terms, which has been these days quite popular. But I think sometimes those terms itself are the part of a problems and confusion. Okay. It's very misleading. Status quo is never as I think that the status quo as it is, because of the dynamic of the world situation, because the changing dynamic of the interaction between two sides and a lot of players here. But back to your question about the Taiwan question, I think that we have seen the fundamental change of the dynamic between Washington and Beijing over the question of Taiwan. I think that in the early 10 years of a new millennia, including those administrations following the Carter's administration since the normalization between two sides, Washington generally, with some measure of the differences, accept the idea of China principle, even if they have their own version of the China principle, so-called one China principle. Even if they have their own version, they have a so-called the policy of one China policy rather than one China principle. But I think at least there are some quite big converged areas of common understanding, including that they reject the one China, one Taiwan. They oppose explicitly the independence of Taiwan, and they also reject giving any state status internationally to Taiwan. But I think that in the past 10 years, we have seen those understanding by Washington, by the various administrations since Carter administration, have been eroded. And particularly in the years of a Trump administration, now followed by Biden administration, those foundation has changed. Now I think the consensus in Washington seems to me is that Taiwan is a strategic asset that the United States could utilize to contain the rising of China. While in the past, I think that at least both sides recognize that both sides should manage the Taiwan question in a very careful and prudent way, avoiding the so-called independence of Taiwan. This is the core or the bedrock of the foundation of bilateral relationship. But such kind of foundation has been eroded quite tremendously in the past few years. And I think this has changed quite fundamentally the dynamic of interaction between Washington and Beijing over Taiwan question.
People compare that because there's a war in Ukraine ongoing and people don't see the end of this war. So I wonder, how do you see this situation in Ukraine, and when will it end? Or because Ukraine is preparing for a so-called spring or say summer offensive, and now we are seeing weapons being supplied to Ukraine from European countries, from the US. Some of them are rather advanced. So it seems the assumption is like, when Ukraine will succeed in taking back some of the territories, and when there's a defeat of Russia, and then that's the time of talking about a peace. Do you see the possibility, that likelihood even, Russia will be defeated, and then until then, peace will be talked about?
Well, I really don't know, because the tricky point here is that both sides, particularly both sides of the warring parties, particularly on the Ukraine side, they still believe that the only time for them to come to the negotiation table is the so-called a total failure or defeat of Russia, which I think that it is very much unlikely. And therefore, I'm quite concerned about the situation evolving of Ukraine crisis, because at least the two parties of the warring parties, both of them are still quite confident that time is on their side, and each side, both sides tend to believe that the time is not ready for a serious negotiation before one side can have a decisive victory on the battleground, which means there will be more bloody and treasure sacrifice and destruction. So it's quite sad.
Yeah, things will get worse before they get better.
And also worse, what is the scenario for worse? How worse it will be? The likelihood of escalation, and if it is spin out of control, that will not only be the destruction of the Ukraine, but also I think the destruction of the whole Europe or even the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it could be even in the worst scenario, the Third World War. Yeah. And I know last month you were in Berlin for this Global Solutions Summit. You met a lot of European, your counterpart, talking to each other. What were your takeaways there?
Well, I think that at that meeting, there are quite a number of meetings. A couple of messages or takeaways. One is the world has entered into a multipolarization instead of a unipolar or even bipolar world. The second one is the multipolarization has taken place in an increasingly interdependent and growing interconnected world, which means that despite of the differences, politically, ideologically speaking, all those economies, European countries, Asia-Pacific countries, United States included, we need to explore the common agenda. But so far, I think that we are still trapped in what I called the deficit of the common understandings of the where are we now, where are we going, and what kind of a collective action we are going to take together. So I think this is the second. The third one is, I think many European countries, they reject the idea of oversimplified or over-dichotomized narratives about China's relationship vis-a-vis the Western country. They think that the diversity indicates the complexity of the interaction between two sides, and so they advocate the idea of so-called pluralism, which means that a different perspective should be involved into the discussion between two sides. It is not a so-called a black and white. It is not a so-called a democracy versus autocracy narrative.
So it's very different from the US view probably toward China.
Oh, it's quite interesting because quite a number of American colleagues, they also support these ideas. So I think that at least we have this series of meetings, those so-called Global Solution Summit, we have heard a different voices.
From Washington.
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chen. Nice talk.